Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to continue our discussion of INFJs at work, particularly in relation to their colleagues. And yesterday we had a look at who were the ideal colleagues for INFJs. And if you remember, first of all, you can refer back to the video I released yesterday, but if you do remember, by way of a recap, I was looking specifically at two types of colleagues. The colleagues that you have in the office that are not necessarily in your line of management, and then the colleagues that are in your line of management. And I was distinguishing between the two because your best colleagues are not necessarily going to be the same depending on where they are located in the ecosystem of the workplace. So I was tentatively suggesting that when it comes to the line of management, the best colleagues are any dominant, and when it comes to the ecosystem, in a broader sense, NI leads are ideal for reasons of being able to relate, to resonate, and to have little islands of spirit, to mini islands of spirit inside the workplace, to be a part of networks of solidarity, mutual understanding. That can be very helpful. But in the line of management, having someone who has the same kind of tunnel vision that you do is not necessarily ideal, particularly if the content of that long-term view is different from yours. They might not easily be reconciled. But we want to look today at what are the worst possible matches in both of these dimensions, and also in the process I'll be trying to cover the other types, those that are not the worst, not the best, but are somewhere in the middle at various levels. And I don't think that I'll be approaching this discussion extremely systematically. I think that I will sort of do it as it comes in more or less spontaneous fashion, and occasionally referring back to my own experiences. Before I move on, stick around if you're interested. Don't forget that I have written a book on the INFJ personality. The Ecstatic Soul is currently the deepest investigation, the reference work on the type. There'll be a sequel coming out soon, but in the meantime, if you haven't got the book, the links are below. There's also The Infinite Castle, which is a novel I wrote a couple of years ago. It's kind of magical realist and modernist and existentialist, and the rumor has it the main character is an INFJ. So check it out. Support the channel. What supports the channel too is supporting me on Patreon, by the way. There's a link below. Thank you so much to my supporters. Keeps things afloat, in terms of everything. So it's really something I'm grateful for. Okay, now let's return to this topic. So in the first place, okay, there's a couple of things here. I think that when it comes to the people who are in the ecosystem of employees of a particular workplace, as opposed to people who are in line management, obviously an important criterion for their being good colleagues is that you can you resonate with them, you have a certain sense of affinity with them, that you have easy contact with them, that you feel like you can create a sense of trust with them, and so there's various aspects to it. There's also the aspect that we should be able to emphasize is that they should also be able to tell you what they think, give you certain kinds of advice. It's not necessarily, or clearly not, going to be the same kind of advice or feedback that you're going to get from colleagues in your line of management, but still, you want people who can have that candor with you as well. So if we take that into consideration, what are the types that we are then likely to resonate with the least? Well, again, when it comes to that ecosystem, we are outside the line of management, so in a way, the dimension of relatedness or the dimension of resonating is going to be kind of similar to what it would be in the real world. And so whatever types you resonate with least in the real world are probably going to be similarly those that you relate to least in that particular dimension of the office. Right? So clearly among the least, you're not going to have types like, so again, we're leaving NI leads aside because they're at the top of the pyramid. But clearly you're not going to have the NE leads either. Right? You're not going to have the TI leads either. It's well known that INFJs, insofar as types that are not NI leads, have a particular affinity with INTPs and ISTPs. For INTPs, it's so well known that it's almost not worth exploring in detail. When it comes to ISTPs, it's not as front and center, but really if you pay attention to videos that discuss things like who are the sensing types that INFJs get on best with, you'll usually find ISTPs at the top, you know. And in fact, a lot of INFJs will tell you that ISTPs are in their top 5 favorite types, full stop, you know, including both intuitives and sensing types. Therefore, that they have an affinity with ISTPs that often exceeds their affinity with such types as INFPs, ENFJs, ENTJs, and you know, ENTPs as well, at least for INFJs. Not for me personally, but I have to take into account of the majority view because ultimately this is what we are most interested in. What are the averages here? So I think that it's possible that you won't have a lot of ISTPs in your immediate working environment because the kind of employment you take up might not be similar enough to the kind of employment they take up as to put you together in the same room, but you never know. To take a very basic example, which is an exaggeration and is a very clear simplification, but I will use that example for the sake of illustration. You could totally imagine that there's an IT department in your office, you know, at the headquarters, whether you work for, you know, company, NGO, public or institution. You'll find TI leads there, you know, and it's true that, you know, usually INFJs will get on with them. It won't be quite the same level of affinity as they would with NI leads, but there are certain aspects that, you know, they will like. For the ISTP, don't forget that ISTPs are in the same family of, you know, what's sometimes referred to as quadra, which is to say that ISTPs and INFJs share the same functions. That's not to be underestimated. It does create an implicit affinity, even though the functions are not in the same order. So if you take, for example, an ISTP and an ENFJ, imagine that you have an ENFJ colleague, and alternatively an ISTP colleague or an INTP colleague. You'd want to say you get on better with the ENFJ because they're such close cousins and so on and so forth. Again, if I were to speak for the majority of INFJs, at least insofar as they've commented on my videos and shared their experiences in my videos, ENFJs are almost never in their list of types they have most affinity with, whereas ISTPs are. So it would seem to be the case that with an ISTP, as far as the ecosystem of work is concerned, INFJs will be more likely to get on with them, or INTPs, versus ENFJs, which might sound obvious to some people, including the INFJs that have had such experiences, but for people who are not well versed in these, or, you know, fine-grained analyses, they might be very surprised by that. Surely, if the only difference between me and someone else is the E versus I issue, well, I mean, we should get on. But there's something about ENFJs, particularly ENFJs in the workplace, that seems to irk INFJs. And in fact, I would even include that. I would include that both in the ecosystem of work outside the line of management and inside the line of management, which is to say that I would not actually place the ENFJ very high in terms of, you know, ideal co-workers for INFJs. Not very low. They will not be the worst. because after all, there's FE, there's NI, and so on and so forth. And that will create at least somewhat modicum of background of mutual understanding. But the thing about ENFJs in the workplace is that they are not a very rebellious type, on average. You know, they're a type that tend to want to make things work, have a sense of duty to the organization, have a sense of an air of respectability at work where they don't put things on a personal footing, and so they place the impersonality of the institution above the personal footing. There is a certain warmth of communication, but it never gets very personal. Okay, might differ if you're dealing with a very young ENFJ who's starting their career, but otherwise, and that's the problem with INFJs, because this flip between FE and NI is a very significant flip. I think it's a flip that is more significant, for example, than the flip between SI and TE, or the flip between TI and NE, or TI and SE, in terms of lead and secondary function. The flip between JE and NI, particularly between FE and NI, is very significant, because NI is a quintessentially individualistic function, very subjectively oriented to, you know, the ecosystem of one's thoughts, archetypes being at the symbolic center, and FE is an intersubjective social function. It's not individualistic. On the contrary, it tends to want to harmonize among different agents and bring them all together, working on the same goal. It's big conflict. Notice that TI and NE, although they are clearly different, they don't have this incompatibility to the same extent. Same with SI and TE. FE and NI really have this lurking incompatibility, and you will often notice that INFJs tend to have not always very strongly expressed for a number of reasons, but they have an innate tendency to rebel, right? To not be impressed with authority, to be skeptical about authority, to not be impressed by the idea that if you follow the rule of conventional authority, you can get to higher positions and make things work even better for yourself and others, because, you know, the ideal of the ENFJ is, in their view, noble, but it just doesn't resonate with INFJs, right? So there is this, it's worse with ESFJs, of course, because then you don't even get the advantage of the SENI axis, right? You get stuck with SI and NE. Now, NE is a good function for INFJ, so we leave this aside, but the SI and I divide, and this also brings us, you know, to the issue of the relationship with ISTJs and ISFJs, is that it's not so much that SI is like FE in that it wants to harmonize toward a common goal, but SI tends to be attuned to process and making sure that different processes interlock together as well as possible, just drilling down to the detail, and have little patience with wider visions of how things should be done, which is the domain of NI, right? There's a vagueness that is perceived by SI when NI is speaking, and SI is frustrated by that. It doesn't see the value in the disruptive ability of the NI function. Is not something that SI is very impressed by. So you can, if we wanted to, again, simplify, because this is a simplification for the sake of illustration, SI is very focused on efficiency of process, NI is more focused on innovation of long-term view. You know, so it's a much bigger picture, and it's easily bored with process, right? And it's the reverse with SI. So if you combine FE and SI, you're not going to have something that is very compatible here. So I probably would argue that in view of this, ESFJs are probably the worst colleagues for INFJs. Possibly second worst after ESTJs, because ESTJs have literally no functions in common with INFJs, and TE has T has more in common with FE than people assume, because they're both JE functions of extrovert judgment. But on top of all the things that are not going to be compatible with the INFJ, there's not going to be this warmth that ultimately INFJs do value. They see it as a human good to be able to communicate warmly, and to put some feeling in their communication, which FE does. Now, it's true that FE can do this sometimes for reasons that are self-serving and hypocritical and manipulative, but INFJs tend, by default, to value that. So if you get no compatibility and on top of that an absence of warmth, that's not good. So ESTJ is probably the worst. And here this applies across the line of management and the ecosystem of the broader workplace. Put ESTJs worse, I put them higher in terms of how bad they are, or how far from the ideal they are for INFJs. I put them higher than ISTJs because, again, there's a solidarity among introverts. You notice that in the workplace, introverts tend to gravitate to each other, even if the broader potential for affinity might not be that expansive. There's at least that initial drive to connect to introverts. Not the case with ESTJs, not the case with ESFJs. And there's going to be a big conflict in the line of management, because if you're, say, managed by an ESFJ or an ESTJ, they're going to want you to apply processes and further articulate and systematize processes, whereas that's going to you can do a bit of that, but it will bore you after a while. And what you want to suggest broader, sort of more bigger picture changes or bigger picture suggestions that I have very little patience with. They might even think that you're stepping beyond your boundaries, and not like that. So, and you're not going to be able to relate them as colleagues as much as others either. So really, like ESTJ, I would put ESTJs as the worst, then ESFJ, then ISTJ, and then ISFJ. Maybe that will shock some people, because they'll think, after all, ISFJs are introverts, and they're so nice, and they have so many letters in common with us. We know that doesn't really mean anything, right? In fact, it doesn't even really mean anything for those that have the same functions as us, like ENFJs in the workplace. ENFJ is not necessarily the ones that you're going to be the most blossoming the most with. ISFJs, I would say that I would not necessarily want to put them as the fourth worst, but if you have an ISFJ boss, things might not work so well. There's going to be this SI process versus NI vision. You guys know I'm not a big fan of that word, but vision clash, that it's not going to be easy to resolve. Sure, there'll be an introverted sympathy and so on, but long term, I don't think this is going to work very well. ISFJs tend to be quite nice as colleagues, right? So I would put them in a neutral zone, right? If I wanted to finish with FI, because I haven't really talked about FI and SE, and I'll touch on these very briefly because this video is running on for longer than I had intended. SE, in the line of management, surprisingly enough, they can be quite fun to work with. They're a bit like any leads, except they're not as ideationally multiple, but they still are, just a bit less. And they're a bit more in your face, a bit rougher, so to speak. But they have this energy, they have this enthusiasm that it can actually really work, right? But it will depend on whether for an ESTP their FE is well developed. For an ESFP, I think that if you're going to have an ESFP manager, I just think it's so unlikely that I don't know to what extent I could talk about it, but that could be tricky. That could be tricky because the SE is not as good as NE, and of course FI is not as good as FE. So allow me to just I'm just I'm going to maintain silence over ESFPs. I hadn't even thought that they could be an INFJ's line manager, but clearly they could be. So if you have insights, please share them. As colleagues, again, they could be fun, but it depends how integrated their feeling functions are. In the case of FI leads, not very good for management. If they're managing you, there's going to be There's going to be a clash between FI and FE. There's going to be a clash in the style of communication, the kind of emotion you put into the communication. And for some reason, like FI leads, in my experience, they tend to see the imposition of, or you speaking out about your long-term view with almost as much suspicion as SI leads or GESI people, and this is something I've not figured out quite why. But in terms of colleagues, they're usually nice enough, right? They're usually nice enough. INFPs, people know I have a partiality for INFPs. I would place them above ISFPs, but they're usually nice enough, although it might be hard to resonate because they tend to be such introverted private people. Okay, so I just had to cover this very quickly because this video has been very long. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and please complete my insights because I'm sure there's much more to say. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, guys, and I'll see you on Wednesday with a video from my INFJ diary. See ya, bye-bye.